Welcome. I'm Sabrina Monarch of monarchastrology.com, and this is the forecast for August 26th to September 1st, 2020. I write these weekly forecasts at monarchastrology.com every week, and I recently branched out to YouTube to bring you audio and visual versions as well. So this week we have a full moon in Pisces at the very end of the week. But these are written forecasts, so I'm just going to read you what I have and add some extra thoughts as I'm going. So let me pull up my slides. And I also want to ask you, if you're new here, to go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Please like this video and please comment with your ideas and thoughts as you're watching this. What resonates with you? How are you doing? I really love to hear from you. So this week, an urge to immerse ourselves in fantasy may rival an urge to edit, fix, or refine reality. One miracle that we can pay attention to is the possibility to be disillusioned of our problems, to see something we have located as wrong, soften and become more acceptable to us. A very vigilant part of ourselves will resist this because we believe that we need to make things wrong and separate ourselves from that wrongness in order to fix it and do something about it. It puts us at war, but sometimes a deeper, more skillful understanding of how to navigate the impasse only comes from forgiving it first and relieving it of its wrongness status. How do we get to this place of sublime forgiveness and acceptance that dissolves problems? For one, peak spiritual experience, but perhaps more accessibly, the steady cultivation of spiritual practices. And I'd argue that peak spiritual experience can be more easily accessed the more that you develop a practice so that you know how to get yourself to that state. The path of growing spiritually can challenge our conditioned ways of thinking or how we tend to operate. One thing I wanted to highlight this week is the concept of spiritual bypassing, which I'm sure you've heard of, and push back at it a little bit. Conversations about spiritual bypassing often leave much to be desired, in my opinion. These conversations tend to focus on how people leverage spirituality to turn a blind eye to problems that they ought to be more vigilant about. The issue that I take is that it's kind of like telling people who are in relationships that they are autonomy bypassing. If part of the spiritual process is acceptance, surrender, and forgiveness, of course, this is antithetical to zeroing in on problems and fixing them. We don't need either or thinking here, but more like both and. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because it's Virgo season, and moving towards a full moon in Pisces means that we're looking at this polarity or this axis, with Virgo wanting to be more perfectionist and refining things, and Pisces being surrendered to bliss states or fantasy states more readily. And you can see when you work with these archetypes how you really need to integrate and balance both, because they offer something that the other needs. All of the opposing signs of the zodiac will do that. So this isn't to say that the phenomenon being pointed to when people say spiritual bypassing isn't sometimes true, but that we need more imagination for the unification of heaven and earth, of ideals and reality. Instead of shaming the capacity to get to a higher place emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, we might celebrate this achievement of getting to that high place and ask how to integrate those experiences and bring them back down to earth. What I have found even more compelling and miraculous in my own spiritual experiments is that some crises in my experience resolve more readily and easily when I enter a state of mind that is the feeling state that I wish to attain at the finish line. Like, what do I really want? And just being there already. Acceptance and forgiveness are part of the process of making change. And when we bypass this phase, when we refuse to accept, it's way more of a struggle to shift things in our lives. It's much more of a struggle to shift something that we have an intense and negative charge about, that we haven't relieved that charge. I personally have also leaned more on forgiveness and acceptance at the expense of being properly discerning. or bypassing anger and going straight to forgiveness and then having to retrieve anger even years later. So there is not one linear way to develop spiritually here on earth. And sometimes we're going to make mistakes. I think that the Virgo archetype is really about refinement and practice, which means coming back to a place of alignment after we've strayed or erred. So often if we're learning something that is a craft or we're getting skillful at something, there's the process of making mistakes and coming back to center. If you want to dissolve the intense duality between problems and acceptance, or problems and, I would say, not necessarily perfection, but a state of being in a sublime reality, try being more honest with yourself about how you are really feeling, even if it's ugly or feels wrong to you. And assert that you love and forgive yourself for having these feelings. Over time, this trains us to stop making problems out of problems and to just let things be. So here's our week after a few announcements. I don't have slides for them, so I'm just going to say them. But I have a podcast, Magic of the Spheres. There's no new episode this week, but we have a total binge-worthy podcast. So check that out on your podcast app of choice. It's a show about spiritual lifestyle and personal evolution. So a lot of these things that I was just talking about get fleshed way out and from many different angles. I also have just closed my books for astrology readings. I'm booked out, but I am still accepting new clients for ongoing mentoring and coaching, which is a 6-month or 1-year commitment. So if you're interested in working with me in that capacity, you can send me an email at sabrina@monarchastrology.com. And make sure you get on my mailing list to get these forecasts to you every week and to be updated and notified about upcoming courses and when my books open again. I'll also be announcing the next Evolutionary Astrology Intensive, which is an astrology course that I teach sooner than I normally do so that you have some time to plan. So stay tuned for that. And let's get into our week. On August 27th, Venus in 19 degrees of Cancer will trine Neptune retrograde in 19 degrees of Pisces at 2:13 p.m. Pacific. So I have a quote to share from that book I mentioned last week, Hardwiring Happiness by Rick Hanson. And it goes, "Once you start having a good experience, a natural tendency is to want to keep hold of it. But if you do this, you're no longer flowing with the experience and are instead standing apart from it, trying to freeze and possess it. There is no more good experience. It is like listening to music. If you hear a great riff and try to replay it in your mind while the song continues, the enjoyment goes out of the music. Therefore, the art is to like the good experience without wanting it. Liking involves enjoying, appreciating, and relishing. By wanting, I mean drivenness, insistence, compulsion, pressure, grasping after, getting attached to, craving, and clinging." That's why I put a picture here of someone grabbing the moon. In your subcortex and brainstem, connected but separate circuits handle liking and wanting. This means you can enjoy something without wanting it, such as enjoying the taste of ice cream while still turning down a second serving after a big meal. People can also want something without liking it, such as ones I've seen mechanically pulling the slot machine handle over and over in a casino, hardly seeming to care if it pays off. So that's from Hardwiring Happiness, which I'm currently reading. Usually what I'm currently reading, well, not usually, but many weeks, what I'm currently reading will make it into these forecasts. So more on this transit between Venus and Neptune. Our sensibilities and desires for sublime experience are highlighted with Venus contacting dreamy Neptune. Beautiful moments will dissolve as any moments dissolve, and we might like to let them dissolve without trying to grasp onto them or grasp onto what cannot be grasped. It's not that we can't experience those same feelings again, but these feelings arise from moments where we feel particularly connected. It's not the moment itself necessarily, but the feeling of connection that the moment triggers. That is the sublime. Venus-Neptune contacts can relate to chasing ghosts, and I mean metaphorically here. And perhaps all the more when we have Venus in a nostalgic sign like Cancer. Reminiscing can have an enchanted quality and might be a source of creativity or insight. Yet, sense into when reminiscing becomes haunting and overindulgent or creates feelings of lack around the present moment. That might be a signal that it is time to re-enchant the present moment and get back into connection with the ongoing flow of reality rather than someplace in the past. So if you have maybe a strong Cancer influence in your chart, or you just know that you're prone to nostalgia, nostalgia can be a very indulgent emotion. It's like replaying and kind of like, yeah, savoring and indulging a memory. And this can be somewhat troubling if that's where we locate, that's when things were good. That's when life was beautiful. And we feel this sense of mourning because we don't have those things anymore. When usually what we are mourning and reminiscing on in a nostalgic mood is some moment that was purely itself, we were present then. So it can be a reminder if you get into a nostalgic spell to find that enchantment with the present moment now. And then on August 29th, Mercury in 17 degrees of Virgo will trine Jupiter retrograde in 17 degrees of Capricorn at 6:28 a.m. Pacific. So we're looking at Virgo and Capricorn and Mercury and Jupiter can kind of expand things, and Mercury is our thought processes. And in earth signs, especially Virgo and Capricorn, I was thinking of the shame spiral and a tendency to go into a shame spiral when we perceive ourselves having made a mistake or some error or misstep, and that this could be a possible thing with this transit, this spiral of thought form after we perceive ourselves having made an error. Or we might feel more externally persecutory of others for the mistakes that we perceive them to be making. The magic then with this transit is learning how to stop the shame spiral, how to break it, or how to tap into some insight that makes this spiral irrelevant. Self-improvement, self-refinement, and being safe do not require self-abuse. It may help to, and sometimes we think that we are being vigilant, when we're doing this practice of beating ourselves up over something, that's how we can be responsible, but there are other ways. It may help to reflect on our bigger picture rationale for why we aspire to be, quote, good. Is it because we are fixing some inherent lack? Or are we just acting in accordance with who we truly are and what we value? If we feel we've made a mistake, we might benefit from a bigger context or even story that can hold our experience in a more forgiving light. What do we make of trial and error? How do we learn from mistakes and have resiliency of spirit? The story of many famous inventors who have a string of failed inventions along the way of a series of failures and victories comes to mind. I'm obsessed with this image. I feel like it is so of the times. I chose this one for August 30th, when Venus in 22 degrees of Cancer will oppose Pluto retrograde in 22 degrees of Capricorn at 6:31 a.m. Pacific. And the same quote that I shared about liking versus wanting is also very applicable here. Venus, Neptune, and Venus, Pluto can be kind of compulsive in love, or like wanting to chase those, states and grab onto them, but they do so in different ways. Venus, Neptune kind of chases the ghost, chases the fantasy, and Venus, Pluto is more of that, like getting deeply emotionally entangled. Venus, Pluto contacts bring power exchange to the forefront. At lower octaves, this can be unconscious or manipulative power games within relationship. But at higher levels, the Venus-Pluto reality is about the metamorphoses that can occur when people with different gifts come together. So different offerings, different strengths that they bring to the connection. We bring different things to our connections. It's not just an equal match of everyone bringing the same exact thing. People do bring different affinities and talents and gifts, and so that creates difference. How do we share or exchange what we uniquely have more of, or what we are uniquely disposed to? The themes of power and powerlessness tend to come up at any octave of the Venus-Pluto dynamic as something like the best that a person will ever have, like that X person is the best that Y person will ever have, or only X person can provide this experience for Y person. I know that's like a weird way of phrasing it, but I couldn't think of I don't know, that's just what came out. So when the stakes become this high, when someone is located as the portal to this particular experience, and the threat of loss becomes too terrible, it becomes increasingly difficult to relate, and we become more susceptible to possessive behaviors, whether we are enacting these behaviors or we're on the receiving end of them, such as when we represent that magical portal and we're the only ones to someone else. It can be one-sided, or it can be like a dual dynamic, more of maybe like a codependent kind of thing. And in the signs of Cancer and Capricorn, so we have Venus in Cancer and Pluto in Capricorn, the themes that may come up around this relate to negotiations around emotional labor, safety, and emotional security within the connection. Am I safe? Do you hold me well enough? Do you make me feel safe? These kinds of questions. Though the themes of Venus-Pluto mentioned here relate to inner development that is ongoing, so things like empowerment or unhooking from toxic dynamics, becoming more self-aware of how we leak our power and our energy, etc. So these are things that last, you can work on that for years and self-refine that as you mature. So it's not just happening this week. But certain dynamics of this nature may be up or more visible, more relevant this week. So one thing to stay mindful of this week, or in an ongoing way, if it really touches something for you that's more ongoing, is to stay mindful if we find ourselves in a position where we feel that another person is making us feel a certain way and we are feeling a charge about it. This can be any kind of feeling, pleasurable or painful. Take this as an invitation to slow down and come back to yourself and question why you give this person that level of power over you. It's one thing to notice how you feel around people or how you feel in situations and use that as navigational information. How do you feel around certain people? And if you feel really good, do you want to be around them more? Or are there certain people that you feel more drained around habitually? But it's another thing to really believe that these feelings are sourced from the other people and that they made you feel those things. When we take more accountability for how we are feeling, when I just want to back up here too, and I'm talking about consensual dynamics, situations you choose to put yourself in. I'm not talking about extreme situations where it is totally non-consensual, but where you are an active participant somehow in the dynamic. So when we take more accountability for how we are feeling, rather than place the accountability on the other person, we can still make choices from there, have discussions with the other person. We will just be approaching the conversation from a more responsible place. There's a kind of magic of two people discussing the subtle dynamics of their connection, being able to not make each other wrong and not coerce each other into anything, but then to find new ways to relate that feel mutually enhancing for both parties. When we do truly love someone and we feel a deep level of psychological intensity about what they mean to us or what the connection means, such as that we feel a lot of difficult emotions arising, this can be an alchemical container for transformation. And then on the same day, at 11:44 a.m., Mercury in 19 degrees of Virgo will oppose Neptune in 19 degrees of Pisces. So there's two extremes that we've been talking about a little bit with Virgo and Pisces, again, represented here with Mercury and Neptune. Two extremes that may need the other. If we have been excessively surrendered and trusting of the flow for something to happen, and we have no logical strategy, we might need to think about that or collect some information or organize our plans a little bit. Conversely, if we overly rely on logic and our logical minds, there may be some unyielding issues that cannot be resolved with logic alone, but instead surrender and inspiration. And then on September 1st, 2020 at 3:42 a.m., Mercury in 22 degrees of Virgo will trine Pluto retrograde in 22 degrees of Capricorn. So the mind's capacity, to collect evidence for whatever it is focused upon is truly powerful. So focus, energy goes where attention flows, kind of thing. By default, the mind will find evidence for its unconscious beliefs and assumptions or historic conditioned ones. Then the evidence we find often confirms our biases, so we just get in this loop. Many of these mental perceptual loops even become addictive, regardless of whether or not they enhance our lives. Try intentionally scanning reality for a chosen value, like fascination or awe. If it's challenging to do, another way to look at this is that you're training your mind to transcend its old habits. Every time you successfully reroute your consciousness to a desired focus, you've built a pathway that you can come back to. I think this is really fun to try it cultivates your mind, but it also changes your reality by shifting what you choose to focus on. And it is a practice. It can be an intention. Some of us do this maybe for the new moon. If you have a certain value that you are attuning to, you can scan your environment for it. Maybe we're doing a research project and that theme that we're researching tends to pop up everywhere suddenly. So you can just play with that at any time in your life if you want to amplify a certain theme. And then we have the full moon in 10 degrees of Pisces this same day, which is September 1st at 10:22 p.m. Nice little angel number in there. And Amelie feels so Piscean to me, so dreamy. So I put a gif of her. The last new moon in late Leo made an inconjunct aspect to Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn in Capricorn. And I'd written about tapping into fire and even emotions like pride to lift ourselves up out of denser emotions like grief or shame. Especially just when you're ready to pull yourself up. It's not like you have to stop your grief process, but when you're ready to, using pride as like a gateway emotion to pull yourself up. And I said that pride could be a gateway emotion before more, quote, enlightened frequencies like forgiveness emerge. And a Pisces full moon delivers such an opportunity for forgiveness. Forgiveness here, it could be like forgiving a specific situation, but it can also be a more subtle kind of forgiveness that is a softened gaze at reality where things are okay. Like there's a transcendent kind of acceptance of things as they are. And sometimes part of what keeps us out of sublime experiencing is that we are focused on what's wrong, what is wrong with ourselves, with others, and with reality. And we have a hard time seeing this data and not reacting to it or not making it a problem. or we believe that judging it is going to enable us to make the situation right. There's a stage in many people's spiritual processes where they utilize forgiveness and acceptance in a way that results in them tolerating and rationalizing something dysfunctional in their lives. So it's like being too like everything's okay, and it's really not, like a mistake along the path. While the other extreme is to be so vigilant that nothing escapes scrutiny, and the cost of that is having rampant stress hormones running through the body and being completely stressed out and frazzled. Would it be possible that some of your problems go away when you neutralize your perception of these problems enough to forgive them and not make them such? If there are little pieces of your life that are out of alignment and requiring some thoughtful action on your part, is it possible that forgiving them allows them to be more malleable and adjustable and therefore more easily addressed? As the moon grows full in Pisces, our fantasy life and our imagination grows and ripens. We can take little details and make a big cinematic story over them, which means we might also choose what we are wanting to run away with, what we are wanting to enhance, versus where we are wanting to check our premises first. So running away with fantasy can be amazing. Like if you're taking your dreams and your inspirations and you're blowing them out so that you see like your most extravagant life path ahead of you and you just go for it. Great use of fantasy. Taking a stray comment that you said or someone else said and like digesting it and going over all the kind of undertones of what it could mean and whatever without just kind of having a clarifying conversation might be more subjectively unpleasant. The moon will be conjunct Ceres and Neptune, so asteroid Ceres, during this lunation, signifying that there may be a release of grief. Ceres relates so much to grief and like underworld journeying. There's also an opportunity here to clear some emotionally charged perceptions of the grief itself that have produced further emotional dissolution. So aspects of the grief or emotionally charged perceptions of the grief that have produced further emotional dissolution. By this, I mean, are there hints to your grief story, what you're grieving, of having been exiled from paradise, or that you manifested it, or that you earned it, that you'll never recover, that this is the worst thing that ever happened, that it really was your fault? It can take time to really pull free from these heavier grief anchors. So one thing I want to mention too is just this idea that things happen in life, like things that we experience as bad or as tragic happen. And they aren't, we don't have to make them our fault, but there's a side of us in our story making capacities that wants to create like a meta story around it. And there is a part of us that could just accept that sometimes bad things happen in life, and it doesn't have to mean these extra tragic stories. One thing that can help to kind of pull out of this grief state, if you like, again, that's not always the goal, but if that's what you would like, is to make a list of all the positive collateral of what still grieves you. And so what I mean by this positive collateral is what came into your life as a result of the difficult experience, even if it's indirect and through a sequence of events. So some examples: people you wouldn't have met but did, and all the things that happened because you met those people, fun experiences you had, expansive experiences, a meaningful mentor or guide that you met because of this experience, a deepened sense of compassion. Like really dig and think of all these things. And like, it's one thing just to hear me say this, but if you put it into practice and actually make that list when you are processing something that you still have grief around, it's really powerful. And one of Pisces' inclinations is to make everything magical, if even only through our perception. So it's not our bedroom, it's our palace, it's not our house, it's our castle. We may do things on a practical level to enhance this fantasy perception, such as if we add more mood and ambiance to a space. Or if we enter a conversation expecting to be fascinated, and because of that, kind of pull out those threads in the conversation. As Roald Dahl once said, "And above all, watch with glittering eyes the whole world around you, because the greatest secrets are always hidden in the most unlikely places. Those who don't believe in magic will never find it." So thank you for tuning into the astrology with me this week. If you haven't already, please like this video, leave a comment, let me know how you're doing, how your full moon goes, or maybe even like what you started out this lunar cycle with. Did you have any intentions during the new moon, and how do you see that this energy of the full moon might relate? As in, you know, how is your new moon intention growing? But anything you'd like to share, what you thought, how you're feeling, I'd love to hear it. Okay, I will see you next time. Thanks for being here.